Gacha game stories are made to suck. They are supposed to suck, and expecting anything better from them is pointless. I've heard this sentiment many times. And while most popular gacha games aren't exactly the pinnacle of writing, I still think they should be held to a higher standard. These companies rake in billions of dollars. They should at least try their best to provide a good story, so players don't have to suffer through endless hours of excruciatingly boring yapping just to unlock some damn event and get some pulls for their favorite waifu. But I don't think gacha stories are made for no reason. In fact, I think there are some inherent limitations that make it harder to tell good stories in gacha games. But harder doesn't mean impossible. I'm going to use mainly Horrorverse stuff as an example because they are doing extremely well financially. They are the biggest gacha game company, they have a lot of resources, and they make some story-oriented games with unskippable story. The first factor that contributes to the lack of quality in gacha game stories is the live service format itself. It takes some time to develop a good story, and quite a few revisions. But the update schedule demands that the story content should be put out regularly, and in considerable amounts. So subpar filler stories are bound to happen, especially in events, but it also inevitably affects the quality of main story quests and character stories. So the story of Wuthering Waves 1.0 is an example of what happens when you have to write a whole patch story in extremely short period of time. It is just yapping all throughout the first few chapters. It has big pacing issues, and they simply left out a bunch of characters that could have been properly introduced. If they had time to think it through a little better, they would probably produce something of higher quality. I used it as an example because we know more or less how much time they had to write the new story. We don't know how much time Horrorverse writers get, but we can see that they produce subpar stories and events for some patches to produce something better for following patches. For example, version 2.6 of HSR is widely regarded as one of the worst patches in the game since its release, both in terms of events and the story, and it happens to be just before a big patch. Guess where all the effort and time goes? Certainly not to the current update. So the lack of time often translates to the lack of quality. In my opinion, the main reason why Horrorverse don't do full facial animations and movement and dialogue, although they absolutely can afford it, is because they want to save time on animating the story content. When you have a 10-hour-long yapping fest of a story, animating characters in the dialogue will take quite a bit of time. Having characters just stand there and alternate between a few basic poses and facial expressions that are the same for the majority of characters, or just fragments of their idle animations, is much faster, easier, and cheaper. And they are pressed for time because of tight update schedule. So why spend time and human resources on animating the dialogues when you can allocate these work hours to making other games to capture more of the market? They have their priorities, you know. And of course, they want to hit a certain duration for the story quests. Having 7 to 10 hours of story content per patch on paper sounds better than having 3 to 5 hours of story content. It doesn't matter that the longer story is just mostly yapping with static models, because they don't have the time to write a 10-hour story that's interesting and captivating all the way through. They wrote a story that would play out perfectly in 5 hours and then bloated it up to 10 with useless dialogue. But the quantity doesn't compensate for the lack of quality, so I wish these games made shorter but more interesting and compelling stories, with better animations and more cutscenes. Nobody likes sitting through pointless yapping for hours after all. The second limitation, related to the nature of gacha games, is that they heavily rely on parasocialism. But in this case, it's not parasocial relationships with content creators or actors, you know, real people. It's parasocial relationships with anime characters. But it is basically the same thing. The reliance on parasocialism makes it so some things are off limits in the story. For example, explicit relationships. Depending on the level of reliance on dating sim experience, even male NPCs being in the same general location with the characters might be off limits. There can be some hints at doomed Yuri, but God forbid there is a man in the radius of 10 kilometers around my waifu. But nobody plays these games for the story anyway, so whatever. Breaking this unwritten rule of no relationships in gacha game will cause a lot of backlash. And it will be lucky if nobody gets harassed and threatened. It obviously limits the potential for storytelling, but the writers can still introduce interesting character dynamics and relationships in the story, just not explicitly romantic ones. However, when the story mainly turns into the dating sim, with everyone thirsting over the MC, it becomes boring and formulaic. I want to see both the booba and the good story. The other story limitation in gacha games also stems from the reliance on parasocialism. It is the ban on playable character deaths. Of course, playable characters die sometimes in gacha games, but it's not a widespread occurrence at all. Horrors haven't risked doing it outside the Honkai games, simply because by killing some playable characters they risk alienating this character's fanbase, as it means that the character won't be present in the following stories and events, and the players who stayed for this character in the game will have no reason to stay, and they won't spend any more money on their eidolons or constellations or skins and so on and so forth. Personally, I think that Himiko's sacrifice was one of the best moments in Honkai Impact 3rd. It was such an emotional point, it played such a vital role in the following events and character development for the remaining cast that without it, the story would feel hollow. I probably wouldn't even remember this game exists without this arc and what followed after. And it was that rare moment when gacha game almost made me cry. That doesn't happen often at all. I think more gacha games should take this step and kill characters. The consequences wouldn't be detrimental in most cases, especially in case of horrors who are super huge. The players, even if they are very outraged about it, will move on eventually. But there will be a strong and memorable emotional moment in the story, if the death is handled well. I feel like I need to make a remark. I don't think that gacha games should kill characters left and right. I just want to say that a well-executed character death at the right moment can elevate the story, add emotional depth, and raise the stakes. Because when in the stories involving planetary scale conflicts and apocalyptic events, nobody of note dies or even gets any lasting, life-altering consequences, it drastically lowers the stakes. When I know for sure that none of my favorite characters will suffer any lasting setbacks, I'm not really emotionally invested in the story. And it's even worse when the writers toy with the darker subjects, throw the word death around, introduce characters whose days are numbered, words that are doomed of desperate circumstances, but in the end don't follow through and provide the best outcome for everyone without any sacrifices and setbacks. And then they are trying to fake dramatic tension by just dumping all the consequences of the suffering and deaths on some NPCs that you've met once or twice, expecting that you would mourn them or something. It just feels like I've been tricked. Oh no, this NPC dude stood here, but now he doesn't stand here. It's such a great loss. I'm gonna cry about it all night. I don't even remember his face. So in my opinion, they should either commit to killing playable characters from time to time, or kill NPCs that are actually important, present in the story, and have strong connections to other characters. Or they can just choose a story that has inherently lower stakes, for example a slice of life story, rather than an epic quest to save the world. And the final limitation of gacha game stories that I want to talk about is the fact that the format of gacha games makes it harder to adequately introduce characters and give them character arcs. This is mainly the issue with games that rely on introducing completely new characters rather than character versions. Gacha games have to make and market a certain number of characters per patch to get the monies and stay afloat, which means they also need to introduce these characters in the story somehow, so the players don't ask who the heck this is when they see the new banner. So these characters have to be put in the story even if they don't really add to the narrative, or they could be easily deleted. This is how we get characters that just appear, hang out on the screen for a few minutes, and disappear into the void. Which absolutely makes sense from the marketing standpoint, but not from the storytelling one. Or alternatively, these characters can be introduced in dedicated events, not taking any time in the main story, but then they will seem unimportant and detached from the main narrative. Character development is also not very easy to do in gacha games. The central characters of the main story arc can have as much development as they need. With episodic characters it's much more difficult, as many of them have interesting character concepts and backstories, but there is very little place to fit them in the story, so their arcs end up being fragmented and stretched over a long period of time, often in events and temporary content. Or they end up receiving no development for a while, just appearing to remind the players that this character still exists within the universe, until the time to really utilize them in the story arrives. Or, in the worst case scenario, they are just mostly forgotten and end up never getting enough screen time. In any case, it will inevitably leave some players feeling like they didn't get quite enough of their favorite character. And of course, the main development has to happen before the character is released as playable, because whatever changes the character goes through afterwards, they have to stay consistent with the playable character's voice lines, combat animations, and overall vibes. Or else the players will feel dissonance between the character they see in the story and the one they get to play. Of course, this can be avoided by releasing a new character variant, but not all games will do this. That's why very often released characters stay static. To sum up, gacha games by design have some story limitations, and the devs have to work around them, not always successfully. But it doesn't mean that it's impossible to tell a good story in gacha game, or that we should settle for subpar boring stories. So, that's pretty much all I wanted to say. I'll be glad to see your thoughts in the comments. This is the end of the video. Bye.